Okay, welcome to another installment of Only Plants. Today I'm going to show you how to use a digital herbarium. So herbariums are, historic records of physical specimens of plants that have been collected over, since colonists came here and botanists were here collecting plants. They've been put into different universities, different museums, herbaria across the country, and they're worldwide, right? So you could go to an herbarium down in Santiago, Chile, and see plants that historically grew there from wherever they were collecting plants from. And so why are herbariums important? It gives us a historical record of plants that were known to exist in certain places. And so scientists over time can look at those specimens and infer some things about how landscape has changed since the time of collection. Also, rare plants, we can find out where historical rare plants were known from. Oftentimes, the older records anyway, are poor quality, so they don't have a lot of geographic information about them. So sometimes they're hard to find. The other way that people use herbariums is to compare specimens. So a lot of times people will find new species embedded within herbarium records that were misidentified originally and have since become either a new variety, new species, and they're embedded in there. So they're finding the distribution of these plants through analysis of previously collected plants. Now, herbarium records, I don't personally collect a lot of physical specimens when I'm out in the woods. I take a lot of photos. I don't love having to like press a plant and then submit it for review and then put it into a an herbarium somewhere. There's a lot of people that do it, and it is a necessary thing that people need to do, but I prefer not to collect rare species or anything like that. And I just take the photos and then report them as we're all supposed to do if we do find rare species to the state, and then let the state handle that however they want to do it. If they want to take a herbarium record sample and put it in there. Over time, I've seen some herbarium record samples, and I can probably show you some today. Interesting plants that have strange distributions. I'll use a few as an example, but it's like the herbarium record sample was, there's 20 plants in it, and this was like the only population known of this species in a particular region, and it's like they almost took all of them, and they were annuals, they were all in flower. So that plant hasn't been seen in a really long time, and I wonder if maybe that had something to do with it. But so I use Pringle Herbarium, and it's through the University of Vermont. I'm actually not sure. I think, when I search through this, there are other states that come up. So herbariums, especially the digital ones now. So you have to use a digital herbarium a little differently than a physical herbarium where you'd go in person and look through samples. This happens to be really easy to search. It's basically like the internet for plants, that are known, that are all scanned and put into this herbarium that you can then view. And to some degree, you can see some distributions. If you know where you're looking for, you can see what plants were there 100 years ago, which is really interesting. I'll show you an example of that today. And it's endless. So you can filter it, search it. It's a lot easier than going into an actual physical herbarium and like looking through all these paper records and cabinets and trying to find what you're looking for and looking at everything. So it's just a lot easier than it used to be. And so I think a lot of people should be using this. It's really interesting. Once you get through it, it's a little clunky to like actually figure out where you need to go in order to do things. But once you get there, the questions that you can ask and look at different things, there's a lot of really cool information to be found here. So I use the Pringle Herbarium. Just type it into Google, it'll get you there. This is their landing page. I go to digital records and then I go into the Consortium of Northeastern Herbaria. So you can limit, this is basically everything. So the consortium is all of the plants in New England. And then you go up to text-based search. And this is where you get to put in whatever you're looking for, whatever you're interested in. And so I use the scientific names. Sometimes the scientific names have changed. But let's look at that one I was talking about, the annual that's has a really weird distribution. So it's called Collincia parviflora. And I'm just going to look at Vermont. And so this plant in particular has a really weird distribution. So let me just pull that up for you for a second. Let's look at iNaturalist. Or let's go botany. This will be a better way to show you. Yeah, parviflora. So this is called Small flowered blue-eyed Mary. So here's the distribution in New England, and then here's the distribution throughout the United States. So, when I was looking at this plant, I'm interested in native plants of New England, especially ones that either haven't been seen for a while or maybe have a really weird distribution. And so you can see that it shows up in the Northeast only in two states, introduced in Pennsylvania and Nova Scotia. And then it's native to basically the rest of Canada and, almost half of the country on the western part of the United States. So, and it is pretty prolific out here. So there's a question, right? Like, is this a really disjunct population of this species? Are these the same species? Are the plants in New England introduced from a species out here? They were moved over. So that's the question, right? We're trying to figure out what's going on with this species in New England, and here's a picture of it for you. So it's kind of a pretty little thing. I've never seen them in the wild. So now when you go back to this, you start looking at Calencia in Vermont, right? Those were our search criteria. And so you start looking at some dates. What it'll tell you here is where it was collected from, some coordinates. If it's a rare plant, the coordinates are usually generalized just for like the center of the town that they were from. And then it gives you a date. So it'll say when these plants were collected. Oddly enough, all of the herbarium records for this species in the herbaria are from the same date. So June 8th, 1935. Now let's look at these. When you click on these are all scanned. Actually, there's a physical copy of this at University of Connecticut, but they scanned this one so that we could view them all. And when you look at this, there's usually a little tag down in the bottom, either right or left-hand corner. It'll give a number. It'll say what species the collector identified it as. And then it'll give you some vague, usually really vague, description of where it was found. So this says base of Slate Cliff in dry ground, Paulette, Rutland County, Vermont. Now, this population probably wasn't very big, but look how many they've collected. This is four. And then, so who's the collector on this? So it was CAW Call or Weatherby. So let's see if they're the same person here. CA Weatherby. Yeah, so this is another one from the same time period of another one, two, three, four, five, six plants. And then here's another four plants. So these are all separate. So that's like, let's just say they collected 15 plants. These were all in flower at the time. Looks like they were in flower, early seed. Yeah, you can kind of see the flower parts there. So, collecting these plants potentially caused them not to reseed. And so when you look at this, the information about this plant, this was the only population of this species in Vermont. And the ones from the other state that they occur in is Massachusetts, right? So let's just look at that real quick, since we know that they're kind of a potentially disjunct population. And there's one record of this, 1967. So it says roadside, east of road that parallels Route 91 on the west side from Route 116, now cut off by 91. So this was found while while building 91, basically. And this person also collected six plants, town of Deerfield, east side of road that parallels Route 91. And I suspect that this plant also hasn't been seen again. So, you know, the take-home message here is that, you can look at distributions like this in New England. These are like red flags for me when I see these, that there's only a few counties that a plant is known from. I like to go back and look at the herbarium records and see when these were seen and why they were seen. So it's suspected that, these viewings, observations of these plants were like 30 years apart. This may have been an introduced population that came in during the building of the road. It would be interesting to know where those people built the road were from. Maybe they were from Michigan or something. Who knows where they were from, right? So those seeds could have come in some way and been distributed there because this plant is an annual. They could have popped up, et cetera, et cetera. So let's go back and we'll look at, so I'm really familiar with like the flora of where I live, and I'm just familiar with things around there. So you can go into locality and you can just search for, we're going to go back to Vermont and going to look at the town I live in and we'll see what comes up there. So I'm basically doing a broad search for all of the plant records for anything labeled with the locality that I specified. And so what it'll do is it's going to give me all of the plant records across time for that location in that state. And these records can go back hundreds of years. So this one's back to 1878. And as you scroll through, they're usually, looks like these aren't in alphabetical order, but they're broken out by what herbarium they show up in, where they're stored. And so one thing I noticed when I was doing this, just looking through all these species that are recorded from here, the one I found was the greater fringed gentian, which to me is a plant that I see much more frequently in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Connecticut. And I don't see it a lot in Vermont. I've seen it on the western side where the soil's a little richer. I found it in some old like cow fields actually. And it's usually close to a little water, but it's found in disturbed sites. So looking at, just having been around where I live, most of it's forested. There's very few open areas, but knowing the historical history of Vermont, almost everywhere here was sheep. People were farming sheep basically. And so a lot of the trees were cut down. There's rock walls everywhere, barbed wire fences. So all of this was at one time leveled, harvested. So the habitat was different. There wasn't a forest here, which there is a forest here now. And so by looking at things like the species that were present here over 100 years ago, I know that when I go out in the woods, there is the potential for me to find these again. And the greater fringed gentian in Vermont is an S3 plant, so it's uncommon. So it would be kind of cool to refine those things. But this brings up bigger questions for me about, you know, how here it is here, gentian options, Cronida. So this is like super close to my house. Hold on, I made a mistake. Okay. So let's look at this. So well-formed plant, looks pretty healthy. This was seen in 1902, so that's, 122 years ago, 123 years ago at 1,500 feet. And so I've gone up into the area where this plant was supposedly supposed to occur 120 years ago, and I didn't find it. But it makes me wonder about the other plants that were potentially out here because this herbarium record's not complete, right? It just happened to be what somebody who was visiting here, if they lived here, what they collected that particular year, and then they put it into an herbarium. So it's an impartial history of the actual plants that would have been here a long time ago. But it gives you some insight into how the landscape has changed over time. And it's interesting to look through these and see plants that maybe you've never seen before but they show up like right near your house. The other one that I wanted to show you was, which I haven't seen, this is another rich plant that I see on the western part of the state way more often than I see here. Where is it? This Parnassia glauca. So this particular plant I've never seen in Windham County, the southeastern part of Vermont, but I'm sure that it does show up here. This one would have been like right around my neighborhood. And this one's actually from July 1980, which is kind of interesting. So not that long ago. I have been looking for this one off and on in the area, but look at how well formed these plants are. They're huge. And it's just gonna, oh no, so it was reaffirmed in 1980. It was actually seen the same time as that other plant by the same guy, 1902. So I suspect that somebody was like visiting here in the early 1900s and they happened to have an interest in plants and going out there and seeing what was out there. But I have, this plant in particular would be really isolated to like a wetland that has higher pH bedrock. That's why you find them on the western part of Vermont a lot. But I have not located this plant in my area yet. And maybe it's just been succeeded by other species and it's no longer here. I'm not sure. But the questions that you get and you can sort of answer through this process are really interesting. The last one I'm going to share with you is for this plant called Mimulus moschatus. So let's see. There we go. Moschatus. And there's actually another name for this too that you can search. So it's changed. Some states in New England don't recognize the change yet, but other places do. So it's helpful to search both names so that they show up. But we're going to look at this one in Vermont, and I'm going to look for it also in Massachusetts. There's a particular record I want to show you. So this is a protected plant in New England for the most part. Yeah, see, I'm not coming up with anything for Mimulus, so I'm gonna have to search the other one. It's like your Rith. So your race. Well, I don't even know how to say that. Let's do this again. Oh, it's that space in there that's doing it. What? All right, let's try this. All right, so we got one record. This one has no. Oh, here we go. Okay, so this plant is protected in Massachusetts. It's an S3 in Vermont, S2 in New Hampshire. So the the distribution on this, let's look at this one. So musk monkey flower, the story with this, so it's listed as native in Massachusetts and Vermont and New Hampshire, non-native Maine, parts of Massachusetts, Connecticut. And then if you look at the distribution across the United States, it has a huge break through the center of the country. So this plant occurs in the western part of the United States. And the interesting story behind this is that this plant was originally reported to have a musky scent to it. That's where it gets its name, musk monkey flower. The populations in the eastern part of the United States did not have that scent, and they think that there's a story that possibly seeds were brought over to New England and deposited, and then they escaped cultivation. And the other story is that maybe they're just a disjunct population, or they're actually two different species. And so if you start looking into the herbarium records for these, things start popping up. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it today, but let's try this again. So that one, let's just try it for, I just want to look at all the records, I guess. So here's New Jersey, Pennsylvania. If I can filter this again. Okay. So there is a record in here that shows there's a note on it, and it's from the early 1800s. It's like the earliest observation or, herbarium record sample of this. And it says found in a wetland, potentially escaped from a pot. So, there's that little hint of a lead there that makes us think that these plants potentially aren't native. And they also have, the scent of them has been gone. So maybe the person who was originally keying this plant out had some weird genetic variation that had a musky scent to it, or, maybe they are two different species. I do not know. But so overall, there's a lot of this to me is a really great resource to be able to use to get information on distributions of plants, historical distributions of plants, ask some interesting questions about things that raise red flags. So when you look at something and you're like, "Huh, that distribution is really weird, and why is this plant native to Vermont but not native to Connecticut or Maine?" Start looking through the herbarium record and asking questions about this and see what comes up. And it just gives you another level of being able to think about plants in a different way and then learn about how they've changed historically over time. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this, churns something in your brain and gets you out looking at these things. If you subscribe, follow, help me get more people to see this page and this channel, I would greatly appreciate it. So spring is coming. There's more things on the way, actual field time, looking at plants, identifying stuff. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.